The GreenSock Animation Platform. I suppose the first thing I just sort of pointed out is that's what GSAP stands for. It seems to get sort of thrown around pretty quickly. Also, let me just get rid of all of this, sorry. So I work for an agency in Bristol called Green Communion. Some of the guys are here tonight to support me. We do primarily websites as well as branding, but most of our websites tend to be sort of fairly sort of interesting websites, and thus we found ourselves needing to do more and more animation. And in the last less than 6 months, I've been using the GSAP to achieve those, and really it's changed the whole way we work to a certain extent. So yeah, I'm going to sort of talk about why you might want to use it and some of the things you can achieve with it, and hopefully some of the less obvious applications of that. Also, just a note about the slides. They're all actually done with GSAP as well. I thought I should at least have some courage in my convictions and show what you can do with GSAP. And it's not always just animations. You can do whatever you put your mind to. So I thought just for giggles, I would do the talk in GSAP as well. So they are a little bit cheesy. When you've got a cold over the weekend and you're just trying to bash things together, sometimes it's the first thing that comes to your mind that goes in. So they kind of vary a little bit as well, so you might have to prepare yourselves for that. So what is GSAP? I think just first of all, I'll do that usual thing. If everyone could put their hands up that has heard of GSAP before, just to kind of get a feel for what it is, and who has used it regularly, and who could teach me a thing or two about it. Just one cocky one. That's fine, I can handle that. So what might you use GSAP for? Well, it's an animation platform, but that doesn't really do it justice. It can vary any value, normally numeric, over a period of time, which is probably, broadly speaking, the definition of animation. But when you think of animation, you tend to think of cartoons or looping animations, just very kind of, click, play, off the animation goes, and there you are, that's your animation. But actually, the more we started using, the more we realized that was just the very surface, and that there was a lot more we could do with it. But broadly, it gives you access to anything that's in your DOM, so SVGs, CSS, colors, text, PNG sprite animations, which I'll go into as well. So yeah, its application is really quite broad. It's also got other plugins like physics engines and sort of SVG morphing plugins, which I'll touch on very briefly, but actually those are a little bit new to me as well, so kind of brush over those a little bit. Ready for the next animation? There we go, nice little elastic animation. So I just thought first thing we should do is look at a really contrived example, something you're not really going to ever want to do in real life. This is pretty ugly and pretty dire, but I just thought we could at least look at the code, see what we can do, and just show you how easy it is really. So these are just it's just a repeating animation, and we're moving the dots left and right, they're fading in and out, and we've got a little bounce animation with the squares there as well. And I think in CSS that would take quite a bit of code to achieve that. But if we look at the JavaScript for that, which GSAP is all in, really I've achieved that in just 3 lines of code. This 3 lines of relatively complex code, I'll grant you, and you could split it down into more, but it just shows you how straightforward the syntax is. I'm going to try and avoid delving too much into code in the talk, but conceptually, what we're trying to say here is that we're going to target elements over a period of time. We're going to vary some values, in this case, the alpha channel, so the opacity, the X value, so left to right, and we're going to tell it what kind of ease we want. So you can see there that I've set the bounce ease for the squares, a power 3 ease, which I'll show you later, a typical sort of slow ease process on the circles, and we're just saying we want it to repeat forever, repeat -1, and yo-yo trues, and it goes backwards and forwards. And the result of that is a fairly simple animation, but it shows how easy those simple animations are to achieve. So I'm going to compare it a little bit to CSS. There are obviously other JavaScript platforms, and some of those have benefits over CSS too. But one of the things I find hardest with CSS animations is the sequencing. So I want to do something, followed by something else, and at that point I want to do something else as well. You can do that in CSS, but it's all percentage-based, or largely percentage-based, and you have to, well, I find I have to quite often get a calculator out. You've got an animation for 3 seconds, and at halfway through you want to start your next animation, so you're going to put a delay of half that time just before it starts, and it quite quickly gets out of control. With GSAP, you can just sequence, and its natural order thing is to sequence. So you can do one thing, followed by something else, followed by something else, and you can also offset that. So you can say, I want to start that next thing half a second before the other thing's finished. And it just gives you a really fine level of control. Easing in CSS, really, without installing any extra plugins, you've only got ease in, ease out, ease in, out. It's a bit limiting. GSAP's got loads. I'll show you a graph of some of those later as we delve a little bit deeper into things. It's quite hard in CSS to get access to properties of sort of things like SVG elements. Now you can do, if you don't set the SVG element values to start with, you can kind of get access to them in CSS. Using something like GSAP really gives you that fine targeting ability on anything that you've got in your DOM. So you can do much richer animations and control anything you want. Also CSS, percentage-based timing, it's not natural. If you've got a designer that, or even just a co-worker over your shoulder trying to help you get your animation right, they're likely to say, maybe make that half a second slower. They're not going to say, make that first bit 25% less than the second bit with 5% offset. So it means you can really edit things with someone over your shoulder, which is really handy. Being JavaScript is really easy to debug as well. There's you can console log everything and use debugger as Chrome tools, but also just for the sake of argument, you can create controls. So even for my slideshow, I've put a little control in, and we can whiz backwards and forwards through the slides, and that's really handy when you're doing your animations. I'll show you some more examples of that. You can press play, you can go back to the start, you can skip to certain points in the animation as well, and that's really handy when you get complex animations. Also, it's just very intuitive. The language it uses is second nature. You can read it very quickly and see and understand what's going on. Whereas with CSS, you end up having bits all over the place, and it becomes a bit of a nightmare. So it makes it a bit more intuitive and thus a bit more fun too, I think. Designed. These first demos at least, anyway. Also, I don't necessarily know how to get it open. I have to follow the link and do it this way. Yeah, so my apologies on this. This is done on a rainy Saturday afternoon. So first of all, the inspiration came from the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy cat and Garfield's lazy cat, and the other thing's a fox. So that's where we went with that. And this one's done in JavaScript, and I just thought, because I've been sort of saying JavaScript versus CSS, we should at least just compare the code. So, this is using keyframe animations, and we've got the fox animation at 0%, it's at a certain place, and then 50% at somewhere else, and 50% at somewhere else, and then 75% at somewhere else, and it's all just a bit meaningless, really. And likewise with the cat, really, he shakes backwards and forwards when the fox gets over top of him, because it's scary having a fox jump over you. And it's just not very obvious what it's doing. Now, I need to see if I can go back. start. Adam, how do I get off full screen? Control tab. Command tab.
No, definitely not.
Sorry. This might happen a little bit. I'm having to borrow Adam's computer today, sorry, so this is Max. Same example, but in GSAP. So the CSS is just there originally for layout. But we can play around with this a little bit too, which is really what I wanted to show. First of all, we can say that if we want the fox to be a bit faster at the start, we can just change the value, and all of a sudden he's going to run in faster to start with, which is great. We can change the easing, so the jump could be just a different sort of ease, and you just get to play around with it a bit more. We can also, I say these demos aren't good, they're great really, aren't they? We can use Bezier, it's got a Bezier curve function as well, so we can make it jump over a Bezier curve, rather than just to top up and down and all the rest of it. So, we just get a bit more control over those animations. That's probably all I'll do with that for the time being. I'm just going to put this in. We can also we can kind of get things synced up a little bit as well. It's got something called split text, which, again, you wouldn't be able to do this in CSS. So it's just, just a bit of fun, really. Adam, sorry, remind me just what the code was to get back to the other one.
Control tab.
Control tab. Right, sorry. So, performance. You'll often hear people saying, out and out, CSS is more performant than JavaScript animations. And it's a fallacy, it's just perceived wisdom. Sometimes that's the case, but certainly not always, and certainly not when it gets to complex situations. It does vary depending on operating system, browser, machine, what you're trying to animate. But the important thing really is just to get out of your mind that you can't use JavaScript because it's slow. It's not. jQuery is slow. jQuery Animate is slow. But nearly any other JavaScript variation, you've got things like Velocity, you've got svg.js, snap.js, there's various other ones that I can't remember off the top of my head. They're all pretty performant. GSAP have made available a speed test. I suppose there should be a certain disclaimer that GSAP did put this together, but I have no reason to believe that there was any underhand tactics to this. So we're just going to have a quick look at that so that you can see when things get complex, that actually, with this example in particular, GreenSock does perform better than CSS. So we'll start off just by looking at GSAP. And we'll start off relatively complex. Let's just say 1,000 dots. And we'll see what Adam's machine is capable of. So typical kind of particle acceleration type demo, warp speed, flying through space, dots flying everywhere kind of thing. And you can see, every now and then it struggles a little bit with 1,000 dots. There's every now and then it's just the smallest jolt. But it's pretty good. I mean, if you were a user, you wouldn't necessarily notice any different there. And if we use CSS, which is this Septo one. Also, maybe we want to just take note of what the FPS meter was seeing. That's kind of a higher FPS equals better performance, kind of broadly speaking. So we're achieving sort of 75, 70-ish FPS with GSAP. And if we go to Zepto, first of all, you'll notice the performance is quite a lot worse. You can actually see them starting to band a little bit. They're almost forming concentric circles, not quite, but the timing function of the CSS here isn't as good. And it reckons we're only getting 0.8 FPS. That sounds pretty low compared to what we're seeing there. Actually, I think it's probably a little bit skewed. But certainly the performance isn't as good as it was with GSAP. And if we go to jQuery, just to sort of re-emphasize what I was saying about how jQuery was bad, really starts to struggle. Oddly, it's saying a higher FPS. I think maybe we'll just ignore that for a little bit. But certainly the perceived performance there is really pretty poor. I'm going to stop that before it blows the machine up. But also just to show that as you get more complex as well, let's just up this to 2000, back to CSS. Really, when you start seeing it there, you see it banding. Maybe let's push it a little bit further. Let's go 3000. Hopefully I won't crash anything. Yeah, well, you saw the start there. It's not great. And GSAP will hopefully handle this better. Yeah, there we go. So it's, again, it had a certain amount of struggling, particularly when it started, but broadly speaking, in this situation, it's more performant than both jQuery and CSS. So, getting the hang of this Mac business. I thought, try and dive into some examples, really. This is PNG sprite animation. The theory being here, we've got a big, long PNG image. Each frame of that image, or each image of that strip of images, has a different portion of this animation in. And sorry if I'm telling you'd have to sort of suck eggs, but essentially we've got a viewport, and we're scrolling that image up past it, much like a film strip on a camera. And that gives the appearance to us that the picture is animating. So it's a bit like think of it as a film strip, essentially. And you can do this in CSS. That's great, it works, and that's what you can see with the background position there. So we are moving the background position over a div that's got its overflow hidden. And it is working. You can also do it in GSAP with slightly more computations. So if we just look briefly at the code here, if we look at the CSS, we are BG animation is the keyframe at the bottom, and that's essentially what we're asking it to call. We're moving the background position from a vertical position of 0 to a vertical position of 100%. Using a steps easing, which means a steps easing is literally like steps, so it does something very quickly and then it pauses, does something very quickly and then it pauses, and it keeps on doing that over and over again. And we're asking, so this animation is made up of 26 frames, and so we're asking it to do 26 frames, 26 steps over a period of 3.75 seconds, infinitely. And the JavaScript is kind of similar. So we're using GSAP for this. And you can see there's some calculations in there that are calculating the duration from the number of frames and the frame rate. And we're calculating how much we want it to transform by. So the important thing here really is that we're using transform rather than background position. So yeah, we're moving that over a stepped ease function. So again, the same sort of easing of the number of frames. And the fact that we can do this computationally is a real benefit when the project that I'll show you in a minute, we've got something like 24 PNG animations on the same page. To write all that out manually in CSS, or even trying to do some form of for loop in SAS would be a bit of a headache. But the important thing I really wanted to show you is what happens when you look at, sorry, bear with me a second, just want to get this set up. Rendering. So I'm going to enable something called paint flashing, and what that does, if you haven't used it before, is it's a Chrome DevTools utility, and it flashes green every time the browser redraws the page, it repaints the page. And again, broadly speaking, repainting a scene is costly in terms of performance. So too much painting, you'll start to notice other things going bad. And so if we enable this, you'll be able to see the difference between using something like background position and using something like transform. There we are. So background position is whirring away, redrawing every single frame, and the transform is sitting there quite happily going along. Now, there's no visual difference between the two animations here. They're both working fine. But put 25 of these on the page and use background position, and you'll start seeing some errors. Other animations won't be working as well. And, if you've got a machine like my laptop, you'll start hearing the fan whir up and overheat, and you probably cook your dinner on it. So just, worth bearing in mind that sometimes you can achieve something in CSS, but it doesn't necessarily mean you should. I'm going to come back to the example in the wild a little bit later on. What I'm going to try and do is show you an example and then show you where, as a company, we've used that in real life, just to show you that these aren't just examples that I've come up with for CodePen demos. They are things that we put out in client-side projects, production being used out in the wild. So I'll come back to this in a bit. This was actually just a loader. It was used on buttons for when an AJAX call was happening, and also on just like AJAX functions. And the reason I've included it is just to talk about something called the timeline that GSAP uses a lot. So the timeline is, you can add any number of animations to a timeline in GreenSock. And you can build them up as well. So this one is actually made up of 4 different separate timelines. We've got the timeline for the wheels spinning. We've got a timeline for the big trails. And we've got a timeline for the small trails, which are the smaller ones on the end. And they've all been added together to form this one animation. And so just very quickly show you how that is. So that's why that wasn't working. That's not going to let me edit it, so I'll just leave that there as it is. But so the bob is a vertical up and down movement, if you can't see. The spin is just something rotating. The trails is made up of 2 timelines in and of itself as well. We've got trails, which is a timeline, trails major, which varies the width and the opacity and the offset of the SVG that those trails are made of. The trails minor, which are, again, made up of SVG elements, the width and the offsets and the opacities. And at the bottom here, those 3 lines, is where we put the timeline together. So we just add the spin, we add the bob, and we add the trails. So again, it just gives us that control over an animation, so we can just focus on one part of it at a time. So I can get the bob right, add that to the timeline. I can get the spin right, add that to the timeline, and I can add the trails and get that to the timeline. And I am going to show you this in the wild now as well. So this was a site we launched relatively recently. And just to show you where it uses, so when we do an AJAX add to cart, you see it just appears on the button before it gets added. It always works a bit too quick. And again, we see it a bit bigger if we go through to the checkout itself. And if I update the quantity here, you'll see the markers coming on there and stuff as well. So just to sort of show we have used that animation in the cool. Parallax. Everyone loves parallax. I can't remember else I did a site that didn't use a parallax. It also gets called parallax when it's not a parallax, which is what's going to happen here as well, pretty much. So what am I trying to achieve here? So what I'm trying to show is that these animations aren't always just animations. This is we're not just clicking play and something happens. This is going to be controlled using our scroll position. And it actually ties in really well with another plugin that I've been using a lot called Scroll Magic. It's quite similar to a plugin that probably a lot of you have used over the past called Waypoints. but it's a bit more powerful than waypoints. It's got that same sort of thing as you can trigger anything in JavaScript when you reach a certain point on the page with your scroll position. But it's also got a really handy feature where you can link it to a GSAP animation. And so you can set the trigger points, you can set your duration, and you can say, once I hit a trigger point, over a scroll duration, run an animation. And what that results in is something a bit like this. So if we scroll down, you'll see the clouds are moving, the background's moving, the girl's moving off into the distance. And that's all just happening on scroll position. And it is achievable other ways. I've seen people do similar things in CSS. I have done similar things myself using an old plugin called Stella. I don't know if any of you use that. It's actually not maintained anymore, which is one of the motivations for moving on from that. But also just the amount of control you have over this is insane. It was so easy to put this together. There's some CSS for initial layout that just sets background images and sizing and all that sort of thing. And then the JavaScript is so simple. Really, it's these 5 lines of code, and we're just targeting each element. We've got one for the background, one for the title, one for the midground, which is the mountains that we just saw, one for the foreground, which is the hills and the road, and one for the girl, which is the girl on the bike. And all we're saying is that over the duration of our animation, we want to move the background to a position of X 30% and Y 30%, so that's a transform. We want to move the title by 400% of its size. We want to move the midground by 40% of its size. And we want to move the foreground by 5% of its size. And we want to move the girl by 115% of her size and shrink it to about half size. And the scene, the second part, is the scroll magic setup. And again, so simple. There's an ID on the element. We're saying we want to start that animation on enter. The set tween is where we say what we want to alter, so that's our animation, our tween. And the duration, which is the height plus the size of the element. And we add it to the controller, and that's it. In 10 lines of code total, we've generated this, and it works really reliably. And even better, we can edit that if we want to, and really quickly we can make the girl go faster, we can make it go smaller, we can change the amount the trees move, or the mountains move, or the clouds move, and we can make the clouds go up and down, and all that sort of stuff, which is really handy. So again, just to show you where I've done something similar in the wild, is another site we did, Fourth Clade, and it's this top element. You can see the clouds move, the sun moves, the mountains and the bush move. This diagonal at the bottom sort of straightens out. We get a little advertising pop up. Standard. So yeah, just to show you that we've used it in the wild, basically. And yeah, that just emphasises really that you can use it on scroll position as well as animation. And a slider. So there are lots of different plugins within the GSAP animation platform. Most of them are free. Certainly the bare bones are free. Some of them you do have to pay for. This uses an example of one of the plugins you do have to pay for, which is they've got a draggable plugin, which enables you to drag and drop elements around the screen. And it also has something called throw props, which is sort of a physics-based thing where you can allow property values to continue after you've finished interacting with them. We had a slider to create for, it was actually like an age selection thing, which I'll show you in a second. And I just thought it'd be quite a good, fun way to do it, really. We were trying to make that site playful on the whole. So rather than just use an HTML5 slider or a jQuery UI slider, it'd be fun just to make it a bit more playful. So this, you can do the normal things. You can, you can click a number and it moves. But I haven't got a mouse here, but you can also sort of throw it around a bit, and it, it goes to the value. You can drag it off a little bit and put it off to the side, and it bounces. Just a, it's a bit of a novel use of it, really. And again, the JavaScript for that was really straightforward. Well, it wasn't that straightforward, but it was really straightforward. There's lots of maths and array calculations and stuff. It seems simple when I say it now, but I think at the time I did a bit of head scratching. I am not going to delve into this, so don't sort of start sweating. Yeah, it uses the GSAP plugin to do this. And one of the advantages of GSAP is that it's so well documented, and there are examples all over the internet. So I certainly didn't write all this line by line myself. Some of it was taken from other places and built upon and improved upon. So yeah, let's just have another quick look at where we use it in the wild. And again, we'll go back to that Kittymoto website, and it was here. So we've got the slider here, and it selects an age. This is also done in GSAP, the little trails. Hopefully you can see those. It might just be a little bit faint on this screen. These were done in GSAP as well. These were done in GSAP. Little bouncing people. Bouncing line drawers in. That's using something called Draw SVG, which is another GSAP plugin. You've probably seen numerous examples over the past few years where SVG elements have their paths drawn in as you get to them and things like that. And it's got a plugin to help you do that too. Go back through everything every time we go back, sorry. Yeah, so I'm not going to leave it there. Sorry. I'm going to very quickly just go back to that slide I was talking about earlier with my amazing little slider, which is really handy. Where are we? I can start my timer. Oh yeah. Cool. So let's look at this then. So this is a project I've been working on a lot in the last 2 months, I guess, 3 months maybe, on and off. And I suppose it sort of represents really where I've got to with GreenSock. There's a lot of GreenSock in here. And also a lot of Angular, which is something else I'm sort of getting up to speed with. And there's sort of the two interacting with each other as well, really. I would expect a lot of you in here have used Angular or similar frameworks. So it's quite interesting to see how these things tie together. So I'm going to show you the PNG animations, but while I go through that, I think maybe it's just interesting to show where I've used GSAP in here, because it's not always obvious. So if I just refresh this page, GSAP plays in the titles. We've got a PNG sprite animation for the brush strokes coming in. And then when you hold the spacebar to step inside, sure enough, PNG sprite animation over a period of time that I set. That brush was one, that was one. So they were both, the brush stroke coming in, that was another PNG sprite animation over the full screen. That was using Angular UI router to sort of say when I leave a page, run this animation. When the page is ready, run the other animation, which is it going backwards. While you're waiting for the page to be ready, show the Mount Fuji animation loader with a little loading animation, which we'll see again in a second. And that takes us to a map. And lots of ominous looking PNGs, which may or may not animate. So there we go. We've got PNG animations here on rollover. And this is where I was saying where we had 25 different PNGs all dotted around this map. The scroll coming down is a GSAP animation, so the image itself is a PNG sprite animation that our animator Chloe did, and I kind of put together with GSAP using that frame-based technique that I showed you earlier. The scroll falling down is actually actual DOM elements, so that's text and DOM elements, sort of PNG backgrounds, and a bouncies at the bottom, which gives it the little bounce in and out. And again, really, really simple. The other thing that's GSAP is the map. the map panel damage GSAP. When I'm in the center, it doesn't do a lot. It should roughly stay still. But I set up 4, well, at its essence, it's 2 different timelines, but there's 4 because of the C as well, which I'll explain in a sec. But I've got a Y timeline that moves the map vertically. I've got a left and right timeline, the next timeline as well. And all I'm doing is watching for where my mouse is on the screen, and depending on how close the mouse is to the edge of the screen is how fast we play that animation. There's also easing on the animation so that it slows down as you get to the edge. And that looks a bit like this. We just move the mouse up, it goes slow, move it towards the edge, it goes fast. As we get towards the top of Japan, it will automatically start slowing down again. Here we go. Start slowing down, now do a nice controlled stop. And there are probably other ways you could have achieved this. You could have hooked into CSS probably directly. But just how simple it made it for me to do was a case of setting up four different timelines. So I keep on saying 2 different timelines. The 4th timeline is almost exactly the same, but it moves the ocean at a different rate to the map, so you get a slight kind of difference in speed between the waves and the map, so you get a little bit of a parallax effect, because we all have a parallax. And you can see I've also tied it to this as well, so every time we move, it moves the thing here. And again, this is another GSAP animation, top, bottom, left, right. It just moves it depending on where you are. Really, really straightforward. So I'm going to go into the next location and just give you another chance to watch that UI router animation. So it knows we're going to leave this state, enter another state when the page is ready, and in between show the loader. So let's just give it a chance to show that. So leaving a state, PNG animation, text is doing a little animation with GSAP. Boom, in we go to another one. And yeah, it's really, really straightforward. Really going to go back to the map. And I just want to go to my favourite one, really. I keep on going to this one, the monkeys. Everyone loves the monkeys. My favourite one. So see the animation again. And we get the snow monkeys in the jacuzzi, which is you can't help but love them, can you? So yeah, that's that site really. So I'll go back to the end of the talk. I'll pull up my handy little slider that I've got set up because GSAP's so useful to control. And yeah, and also so I'm going to sort of invite questions really now.